Yes, we forgot to report. The technical details go on and on and on. Next year, when we're in person, it's going to be so much better.
We'll be getting presentations recorded. I
Yeah.
understand this.
Don't forget, speak to that.
My name is Megan Westman,
And I'm William Melissa.
and our presentation is on America's wars in Asia and U.S. public opinion from 1950 to 1975. So I primarily studied the Korean War, and William studied the Vietnam War, and we'll compare the major themes that we found between the two and how they changed public opinion. So a little overview of the Korean War. The Japanese Empire collapsed after World War II, which left Korea without a government, since they had been a colony of the Japanese Empire. Korea was divided at the 38th parallel, with the USSR controlling the north and the US controlling the south. And soon Kim Il-sung took over the north and the Communist Party there, which spread throughout the region. And Syngman Rhee took over the south as the president of the Democratic Republic of Korea. In 1950, North Korean forces invaded South Korea, beginning the Korean War. And 2 days later, the UN called on member states to join in and aid South Korea, which is how the US entered the war. And in fact, from Gallup polls that I found in the Library of Congress, the U.S. public opinion actually favored entering this war, with 81% of the public favoring it, and 70% of Americans actually favoring higher taxes in order to support the war effort. So the influence of the media on public opinion, I found that many people in the 1950s still lacked televisions, and those who did have televisions used it primarily for sports or entertainment purposes. The newspaper was used primarily for news sources, and it was presented usually as a police action or as heroic action, as the government did not want people to see this as another full-out war. In fact, this made it seem that this kept it from having a rally around the flag effect, as people thought that it was going to be a short-term war that we didn't need a lot of support for. However, the public soon became war weary as the number of casualties increased, and war weary as they believed that it would lead to World War III. It was important to keep public anxiety at bay, though, because otherwise it could have led to widespread slacking off, opposition to the higher taxes, or shying away from work in general, which would have proved disastrous for the war effort, especially if this got to the armed forces. The news stories that were published about the war were often buried in the middle of newspapers and got very small sections in the newspapers, and any news that was going to injure U.S. morale was highly censored, especially by General MacArthur, who had a heavy influence over editors. Looking at the casualties of the war, we found that people are very sensitive to small losses in the very early stages of war. Looking at this graph comparing World War II, Korea, and the Vietnam War, we can see that there were a high number of casualties, especially in the beginning of the Korean War. And it was found that every time American casualties increased by a factor of 10, support for the war dropped by about 15 percentage points. Another huge turning point in public opinion for the war was the Chinese intervention when they came to aid North Korea, which led to even more U.S. casualties and turned public opinion against the war. Also, the change in the cost and length of war, as it began to cost more and go on for longer into 1951 and 1952, made public opinion for the war stop. Looking at the anti-Asianism aspect of the war, it was also believed that the Koreans need to be civilized, and many of the U.S. public believed that the prisoners of war should have been described as Oriental, which is a derogatory term applying to Asians, and that the Asians should adopt an idealized American manner. Operation Rat Killer was carried out by both the South Korean and UN forces against guerrilla fighters who were referred to as rats, and they needed to be caught in rat cages. And the term killer was also very highly controversial, especially in the Pentagon, as they did not want the public to hear about this term, since it was, like I said, it was a controversial term referring to killing the guerrillas. And looking at this Gallup poll that I found from the Library of Congress, there was a question asked to the American public whether they would rather support Western Europe against communism or Asia against communism if it came to that point. And almost 50% of Americans would have rather supported Western Europe against communism than Asia, where only 23% favored that, showing another aspect of anti-Asianism, and that the U.S. believed that we needed to enter the war in order to protect the Asians. Looking at the prisoners of war, by the fall of 1950, 10,624 soldiers were missing in action for the U.S., and it soon became a political topic and one that changed public opinion after there were many failed exchanges of the prisoners of war. In fact, this public opinion about how each country treated the other one's prisoners of war framed the nation's humanity, and the media soon began to display photos of the dead GIs and the government attempted to boost public opinion by turning the war into a moral crusade for human rights.
Similar to the start of the Korean War, Japan is leaving after World War II, and France wants to reassert control over its old colony. However, Ho Chi Minh is leading a nationalist and independent movement for Vietnam. America doesn't understand that Ho Chi Minh is making an independent movement, and it assumes that Ho Chi Minh is doing another war of liberation, which is a communist Chinese term for a sort of global revolution starting with the peasants. So America believes that either Vietnam will become a puppet of the Soviet Union or China and doesn't want to lose influence in Indochina. So they help their French ally. Remember Megan's graph about wanting to support Western Europe communism? So they wanted to support their ally. However, France gets defeated at a major battle at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, and the Geneva Conference is made as a temporary peacemaking attempt after this. This actually splits North Communist Vietnam between non-communist South Vietnam. Right after France starts to leave after the defeat, America wants to stay to help build up South Vietnam. However, I believe that this connects to anti-Asianism because America assumes that it can be the culture to uplift South Vietnam and create a South Vietnamese identity, not understanding that Vietnam can build up itself, and it assumes that either it'll be a puppet of China or it needs to be built up by America. America understood from France's failure that they needed to make a better revolution. So they needed to have a better society than what Ho Chi Minh could promise. However, they put in No Dinh Diem's government for the South Vietnamese president, and he silenced opposition and didn't actually institute any worthwhile reforms. Despite this, groups like Michigan State University Advisory Group, leading American intellectuals, glorified Diem's regime and don't hold him accountable for his actions. Another part of my research that I wanted to focus on was finding Korean War analogies. This is parts where I've mostly looked at where the phrase "another Korea" was made, particularly in newspapers. From this research that I found that there was something called a Never Again Club amongst generals after Korea, where they thought that having a costly limited war like Korea was not worthwhile, that instead we should use a full nuclear arsenal for interventions like this. However, the other side of this, the very opposite, was that we should not involve ourselves in these kind of wars at all. This is typically found amongst Democratic senators in 1964. And I felt like this debate was very concise between Johnson versus Goldwater. Johnson did not support using full nuclear arsenal. Goldwater did. And even Eisenhower, after his presidency, recommended the use of nukes. To display some public opinion for how people felt about this, I wanted to compare this is a Gallup poll from 1964, soon before the elections. And I wanted to see how people felt about each party. However, this graph is a little lacking for people with nukes in Vietnam, as civil rights was also a very important issue, and Democrats and Republicans differed very much on this. So I wanted to go to more a public opinion between withdrawal and escalation. So the reason why, so blue is withdrawal, red is escalation. The reason why this first graph is so small is that 60% of people interviewed in the Gallup poll were not following the events of Vietnam. So there are very few people that actually had a polled opinion. In November, this changes as the Gulf of Tonkin incident is used by Johnson to help publicize the war. So more people are following the events, and they're leading towards escalation from this perceived by this attack from the North Vietnamese. Escalation tends to rise up as the Johnson slowly increases the scope of the war, slowly involves more and more. However, the American public realizes that this escalation is not working in November of 1968 when withdrawal starts to come up a little more. This is the failed North Korean offensive of the Tet Offensive. While as a failed North Vietnamese, invasion, there were still high casualty rates, and so the casualty rates bothered the public more. And this is also further shown in May 1969. This is the famous Hamburger Hill battle, where over 70 were killed, American soldiers were killed, and over 300 were wounded. And no data is pulled past 1970 because the question wasn't even about escalation, it was about whether you wanted to get out of the war before the end of that year. So I've mentioned the Korean War memory, but I also wanted to show how Korean War memory was affected after the Vietnam War. So I believe this quote summarizes it very well. The Korean War now appeared an example of resolve, rather than a metaphor for a disastrous limited war, a role increasingly filled by the Vietnam War. So the Korean War is no longer that memory of a costly limited war. Vietnam is so much more readily that example because of higher casualties and greater failure there.
So the Korean War is also referred to as the Forgotten War, and this is because Americans wanted to forget the war because of the high number of casualties that occurred. It is also called the failed war because it was a war that we lost, and many Americans don't want to remember this. Also, the fact that the war was very far away from us led many people to forget that it even happened. It can also be referred to as a revisionist historiography, since many historians used to think about it in terms of only being in the war to contain the spread of communism, but now they're looking more at the aspect of the anti-Asianism and how we wanted to join the war in order to protect Asians because we believe that they needed our help. This also changes how the public views foreign wars today because we believe that we need to intervene in these Asian affairs.
For an interesting aspect of looking at public opinion, we went to DC to look at some of the old war memorials. World War II is very special because it certainly glorifies our intervention there. It's remembered as a great victory. It's changed a lot in terms of the Korean War.
However, the Korean War Memorial is definitely more sober than the World War II Memorial. It's not in a very significant location. It was actually under restoration when we visited DC, and there are no really proud aspects of it comparing it to the World War II Memorial.
Vietnam, even more so on this, where the whole memorial, it looks like a black star, and where the names of the deaths are listed in chronological order, and there's near to little no propaganda message or message tied with it besides the names of the deaths.
So some of our main findings are that the media was a heavy influence on public opinion during this time. As I said before, there was hardly any TV during the time of the Korean War compared to the Vietnam War, where there were more people having TVs and there were more protests during the Vietnam War. Also, the Korean War really started the aspect of anti-Asianism, as this was one of our first wars that we entered in order to protect the Asians.
Anti-Asianism shows up in nation building, where it follows modernization theory. We believe that Americans and intellectuals at the time believed that Vietnam could only be uplifted by a bigger nation, and they wanted to be America, lest the Chinese would make it their puppet. We also saw that casualties made a major difference in public opinion. The beginning of the Korean War, there's heavy involvement and heavy casualties. In Vietnam War, especially after more intense battles and higher escalation, more casualties were made, public opinion went down. We also specifically focused on war memory. And so Korea used to be the cost of limited war example. Vietnam became this example. And this is also shown through George H.W.'s assurance to the American public for intervening in the Gulf War. The Gulf War will not become another Vietnam. And with this picture here, this is actually from the Korean War Memorial. So while the Korean War Memorial is a little bit more sobering in terms of deaths, it still has this sort of that the Korean War was an example of resolve, and it was still something that was worthwhile, even if it had heavy losses, but the freedom is not free. This is very different from the Vietnam War Memorial that does not have any sort of message like this.
And our references and acknowledgements.
Any
Yes.
questions?
So first of all, can you come teach us in my classes? But also, so you went to the Library of Congress.
Mhm.
What kind of primary sources did you find there? How were they helpful to you? Yeah, I want to know about your primary sources.
So I pretty much read Gallup polls for 7 hours, which was actually a lot of fun because it was
Primary sources are
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah, so I found just so many information that I wish I could have added even more into this presentation. But yeah, that was actually a lot of fun to just read through all of those. So that's what I did for 7 hours.
Using the Library of Congress's databases, I was able to find a source that went into depth on how Korean War analogies were made. They went specifically more into why Korean soldiers were put into the Vietnam War as an example that they wanted another coalition like the US was able to achieve in Korea, but was not able to achieve as much as Vietnam, but they still wanted that pole, which actually ended up being a bigger problem as the Korean soldiers were too expensive and actually not that helpful.
Sure, I have two questions. There's not time, I just have one. Can you give the slide where you have the opinion poll in front?
The withdrawal versus escalation?
Yes. Sample, exactly the same question and so forth. From your research in the Library of Congress, did you find that there's the same sample sizes and so forth, so that the data and change across years is really comparable?
Disappointingly not. So that first graph I had, that's public opinion Gallup poll that I found at Library of Congress. However, most other of this data comes from a secondary source where they weigh withdrawal versus escalation using, most of the time they do use Gallup poll data, which will have similar sample sizes, but there was a few months where I believe they used research specific to Michigan. So if there's more time for this research, I would like to see a better study using more similar methods of research.
I'll ask you later.
I'm sorry.
I want to ask you two questions, sorry.
You get one.
Okay. I see you have spoken about Korean War and Vietnam War and used the term Asian or anti-Asian. I'm curious to know why Asian, because Asia is, as a continent, much bigger than just Korea or Vietnam. Middle East also part of Asia, India, and a lot of other countries.
I believe that, so what I mentioned earlier with nation building was that America assumed that China would be the one to influence all these countries, because American understanding of Asian culture at that time was that China was the hearth of any sort of involvement. They used to be this big empire, and China especially was making more arguments that they deserved their old lands from old emperor times. So we use a lot of Asian specific language because America at that time was using Asian specific language, assuming that because that communist China would expand, that they wanted to expand to all of Asia and that they were the only source for real cultural uplift. And we wanted to beat them to the punch, especially in Vietnam. All right.
Where are the other ones? Maybe.
All right, hello everyone. Today we are going to present our 2021 summer research project titled Assessing Virginia's Monument Landscape. We hope you enjoy it. In addition to the presentation, Tommy will now be passing out an interactive survey for you to complete as we present. If you could just take one and pass it back as we go, that'd be great.
Thank you, Dr.
Okay, first, I just want to give everyone a bit of background on what the purpose of our project was. Since day one, we have investigated monuments throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia and have had constant discussions about some possible solutions to the discourse that currently surrounds the most controversial monuments, museums, and historic sites. We set out to hear and understand an array of opinions about Confederate monuments, some of which we do not personally agree with, that are riddled with the lost cause narrative. The lost cause narrative, which I might add here, is a belief that the Confederate cause was an honorable fight to defend the Constitution and states' rights. Those who think this way do not view slavery as the cause of the war. We explored the monument and museum landscape to learn more about how historical events and figures are remembered and how that has changed over time. We were looking at some events as large as the Civil War. We have found out quickly that Virginia is a place with a lot of diversity, but not much inclusion in its remembered past.
Thank you, Josh. Now I'll tell you about our methods. We utilize many different methods to come to our own conclusions. A lot of our methods are over Dr. Gerald Drago and his long collection of newspapers since 2017. Right in the direction of the people that we needed to talk to and the places that we needed to go. By traveling the state, we often encounter people by chance at sites that we were at. Like at the Black Lives Matter protest at the Robert E. Lee statue, we spoke to a young man named Lawrence about the efforts that they had been putting forth. And on the far right, we spoke to the Rockbridge Republicans in Lexington that we just stumbled upon headed to the Oak Grove Cemetery, which was formerly Stonewall Jackson Cemetery. To ensure that we were keeping a diligent record of each of our trips, all of our interviews, we had no idea how we were going to do it. But thanks to Dr. Alpine, we were speaking at her yard sale, and she gave us the wonderful opinion to do a blog. So right now, I can encourage all, it's on the survey at the top two and here, to go look at vamonumentlandscape.tumblr.com.
Okay, places we went. As you can see by the map here, all the pink Post-it notes are everywhere we went. We were able to see and examine parts of Virginia that none of us had even seen before, even residents that have been here their entire lives. As you can see by the list of places on this slide, we started within the city limits of Lynchburg and went as far as Washington, D.C. and the coast, Hampton Roads region. As Tommy depicted earlier, we performed a literature review of compiled newspaper articles from the News and Advance, the New York Times, the Roanoke Times, and the Richmond Times-Dispatch.
Moving on to the people that we interviewed, thankfully the powers of Google Meet, Zoom, and email helped us contact so many different people, but also thankfully to vaccines, we were able to speak to people in person, which was really incredible after not seeing anyone for months. With an internship that I was lucky to do with Dr. Dodgemont, we actually had a list of almost 100 different people who worked at museums and historic sites across the Commonwealth. We were looking at how COVID affected the museum and how race relations over the summer of 2020 affected their interpretation. So having contact with these individuals perfectly set us up for this summer research project. It really shows that Randolph is a big community of scholars. As I stated prior, not all of our interviews were pre-planned. As Dr. Strako mentioned to us a little while ago, it's like we took part in a mini American culture program facing different people every single day. So we're both going to cover our most transformative day trips. As you can see, we went to a lot of places, so we're not able to cover them all. But I'm going to cover Dale. This is where I'm from, and this sign here that says, "Thanks for visiting the last capital of the Confederacy," is 5 minutes from my house. I pass it every day going into town, and I pass it every day going to work, and it honestly kind of started to blend in. I wasn't noticing these things anymore. And although I know what that flag represents, hatred and violence, and just has a long legacy, it kind of just melted back and it became normal. But visiting Danville with Dr. Strako and Josh, I got to see how abnormal it was. And then we got to talk to these people. They're called the Virginia Flaggers. They're all across the Commonwealth, and they have some really interesting opinions. I'm just going to give you a few. So they believe some false and outlandish histories, like Lincoln and Marx corresponded during the Civil War. They were currently in the liberal-controlled second Reconstruction of our country, and that the white Scots-Irish were really the slaves. So if that doesn't tell you anything, having these alternate conversations with other people with different opinions is productive when they're saying facts. But these aren't facts. Forcing misinformation onto other people is wrong, and it always will be.
Now, the transformative experience that I would like to highlight was James Madison's Montpelier. And we were fortunate enough to get a tour of the home of James and Dolly Madison from a recent non-traditional graduate named Zeb Gray. He introduced us to some members of the archaeology team, including the director and volunteer field workers. They are finding artifacts that belong to enslaved workers of the Madisonian era, as well as workers that were there during the DuPont family ownership of the land. And with this mere distinction of color exhibit and a groundbreaking collaboration with the enslaved descendant community really recently, Montpelier joins Thomas Jefferson's Monticello as a presidential home that presents an honest and factual interpretation of the past. We should be able to celebrate the contributions of Madison to the foundation of the United States of America, as he is the father of the Constitution, while also making sure that the stories of the enslaved are shared as well. The two pictures on the right are of the enslaved cemetery and the segregated train station from the DuPont era. Every Juneteenth, which is a national holiday that celebrates June 19th, 1865, when Major General Gordon Granger announced the end of legalized slavery in the state of Texas, Galveston specifically, descendants perform rituals at the cemetery to honor original African slaves from the early 1700s.
We got to see many different monuments all across the Commonwealth, and we had a few overnight trips. Again, the most transformative experiences for us both.
Now, the picture on the right, or the left, I should say, is from the Tredegar Civil War Museum. And the American Civil War Museum is a place that combines the history of the Confederacy with that of the Union. Throughout the museum, nuanced questions prompted us to critically think about the effects of the Civil War then and now. The Abraham and Tad Lincoln statue that you see in the second picture outside made us think of a nation that we are still trying to be, and that's a united one.
Moving on was a very different place, Monument Avenue. It was definitely a place to see, but it was shocking for me to see a row of treasonous soldiers in our Commonwealth. I asked myself many times the questions that Civil War historian Ed Ayers asked himself. If people came from Mars and saw these monuments, what would they think our history is? I'm thankful for the removals of these statues that hold nothing but hate and false lost cause narratives. There's an obvious difference between Confederate memorials and Confederate shrines, as these we have seen, and monument falls in the latter. Next, we're going to cover the moments from Alexandria and Arlington. This was actually my personal favorite trip of the whole summer. As you can see here in this photo is the Contrabands and Freedmen's Memorial Cemetery. It's a sight to see in Alexandria. A team of archaeologists actually found this cemetery of freed African Americans underneath a gas station. As you can see that we have left behind a lot of our histories, and we're very happy that places like Alexandria are moving towards uncovering these and telling their stories. In Arlington, the Arlington House is finally reopened. You may know this as a shrine to the Confederate General Robert E. Lee and may want to avoid it, but now don't do that. It's a thought-provoking educational center that has a museum, a house tour, and it has finally correctly interpreted its enslaved quarters. Those used to be gift shops, but they were enslaved quarters before. Now they have returned originally to what they were and gives out the stories of the enslaved people and their descendants.
Moments from Washington, D.C. Now, I visited Black Lives Matter Plaza last summer, and it was an essential moment of my life, absolutely. And we went back this summer. This living memorial allows people from all over the country to reflect on injustices of the past in order to move forward to a future where everyone is treated equally under the law. Each of us had an emotional reaction to seeing the bright yellow words continue to be displayed, and we hope the city continues to maintain them. One must ask, what does it mean for African Americans to see the Emancipation Monument on the right? Should Abraham Lincoln be treated as a deity while a free African American is marginalized and kneeling? It is time for us to have uncomfortable conversations about this monument as well as others. And the first African sign right on the left, that is outside of Fort Monroe, a decommissioned military base and current national monument, thanks to President Barack Obama, and that is at Old Point Comfort. This is a place where the first Africans arrived in the British colonies of North America in 1619 and was the precursor of slavery in America. As we looked down at the Atlantic, each of us closed our eyes and just listened to the water crashing on the shores. We all shed a few tears in reflection. This spot was essential for us to experience as a group and made us reflect upon what still needs to be done to remember the past effectively.
Next, we went to Petersburg, and going to the Confederate Cemetery at Blandford was a lot like talking to the flaggers again in Danville. We had a young man touring us around the cemetery, telling us all kinds of lost cause narratives, like the reason why Confederate monuments of soldiers are on courthouse grounds is because that was the last place that mothers and daughters said goodbye to them. We actually fact-checked with Dr. D'Entremont, the Civil War historian, and he said that is false. We saw the statues and rebel flags flying all over the cemetery, and I asked myself a question. Is it better to consolidate the crazy in this area, or do we want to change this place too? It's a hard line to draw when we're knowing the misinformed and determined folks who run places like these. So where are we going to go from here? As an educational institution at Randolph College, we want to be at the forefront of having uncomfortable conversations and learning from them. In the fall of 2020, Dr. Shrako and Josh had the idea of having historical signage about Indigenous people that have occupied the land of Randolph College. Dr. Shrako opened the idea up to our Race and Memory course in the spring of 2021. And after a lot of collaboration with other students, we finally had the idea to create a walking tour on campus that walks us through the history of Randolph College and the land that it sits on. Signage would recognize Indigenous groups, enslaved people, and those who were affected by and stood up against the Jim Crow era. We hope to include notable alums and faculty members, as well as the whole narrative of Randolph-Macon Women's College. This would include interpretation of how our own Confederate statue was put up and taken down. We thank you so much for listening to our presentation today, and congratulations to everyone who presented today.
Dr. Licata?
So this project is all about public history, right? We're academic historians as students, but you're also public historians. And so I wanted to ask just, what do you think the importance of public history is? Should we be teaching it in our schools like Randolph is doing right now? What are your thoughts on public history in general?
Public history has been an essential field of study for me personally. I've taken some classes with Dr. Shareko that have related to public history. I think everyone should try to take them because it really affects how we see the things, the monuments, museums all around us, and how that has changed and still needs to change. There's some things that are behind the times. The Robert E. Lee statue is still there. It's still in court. So public history, I think, is an essential field for everyone to experience at least once in a class. And I think both of us expressed the hope that public history continues to be taught, not just in college, but secondary levels of education.
Of course, yes, I agree.
I have a question.
Yes.
So what do you guys think? Should the monuments be taken down? And I love your question. Should the monuments be taken down and signage put up? Or should they be put in museums? Should they be destroyed?
So we have differing opinions
We do.
about some. So I believe anything that is placed on a public street should be taken down and should have signage placed there. But there are some statues that we actually agreed that were in cemeteries that didn't have the lost cause narrative written on them.
And
They-
that's
yeah.
where I kind of come in, where before this project, I would have said, take them all down, they all deserve to go away. The ranch, like, no, not good. Sorry, I lost my words. But for me now, I'm looking at them and seeing, obviously, like Robert E. Lee, that's a shrine. But then you have others that are memorials, and we need to read them for what they are. And of course, them being on public places, like courthouse grounds, it doesn't matter what they say. It's still an intimidation point for anyone who may walk near them. But there are places where there are Confederate monuments, like in battlefields or anything. If they don't have a lost cause narrative and they're there as a memorial, I feel like they're an appropriate place.
Dr. Warren.
So you mentioned that in your interviews with people and conversations with your research, you discovered there's a lot of misinformation attached to Civil War flags, monuments, and so forth. And when you talk about public history projects to put in place, signage that explains the true, more accurate understanding of the historical context. But that's in situ, people have to visit, and a lot of the misinformation is probably coming from electronic sources online. So how might you try to meld the two so that public history is widely accessible and anchored in some of these in-place locations, but also is widely accessible that you have a chance of combating some of the misinformation that's in the virtual world?
I guess when it comes down to the misinformation side, it's honestly harder to find, and they make it that way for a reason, because obviously their narratives are not the most widely believed, but like, for instance, when we were trying to find the Virginia Flaggers website, you had to have a strict login. A lot of the Facebook pages were locked. So their narratives, they almost try and keep it in a bubble, except for where they're on street corners. So like when we did talk to Virginia Flaggers, funnily enough, I was a spokesperson and kind of had to be. But when we were talking to them, we had to really be on our toes because they'll start to retract. So it's a really interesting kind of relationship that the real history has with their misinformed histories. I hope that answered your question.
Why did you have to be the one to point for flags?
Because of our accents, they would notice.
So you were trying to sort of switch to be able to get them to trust you and have some sort of.
Yes, we were
Right.
trying to establish some sort of trust with her having a Southern accent and being from Danville, the area that we were in. We thought that would be essential to getting more information on
Right.
what their beliefs are. Thank you.
Thank y'all.
Okay, we're gonna try this again. Come on. Maybe not. Okay. So, great job, everybody, and thanks to everybody. Now I've been involved in summer research for, I think I've done 7 out of my 10 years here. I'm second year as director, and this really was an amazing group. You all had so many challenges, and I just want you all to give yourselves a huge amount of credit for the flip-flopping back and forth, the shifting when you got to travel, to being able to adjust to the half online, half in person. I also want to give a huge shout out to Louise and Aaron because we could not do this program without them. I'd also like to say hi to a week ago. Both of them had to leave. So, Dr. Angelelli, Provost Angelelli, could you please? Thank you. But I did want to just acknowledge all the work that Dr. Sheldon has done over the past many years. He established the Center for Student Research. He established the SRP. He has helped establish WWII. He has given such incredible and invaluable services to this college. And I know he'll continue to be involved in both. But I did want to give him a round of applause for everything he's done. Last thing, for the faculty in particular, we do have travel grant money available. We are still trying to figure out what the regulations are going to be, but there is money for conferences. And right now, I think it's still within Virginia or car travel. We are hoping, there are no answers right now, we're hoping there's no more outbreak and that there might be abilities to go to actual in-person conferences. So we will be sending out more information about that, and you can apply for money for faculty to go, for students to go. Obviously, any virtual conference will be able to fund. And we'll sort of be able to figure out what's going to happen with the in-person conferences. So, yes, Dr. Warren. That is, yes, apply with the hopes that we will be able to travel in this way. Because it's better to have the paperwork done and have it approved. And then if travel restrictions open up and you get on your plane, you get on your train, you get on your moped or motorcycle or whatever the heck you're going to do. But do apply so that we know how we can parcel out the money with the great hope that everybody can go to some in-person conferences. So I would also like to ask everybody who is not graduating this year to please apply again. I mean, you guys are doing a fantastic job. We are so appreciative of everything you guys put into it. And does anyone have any final? Yes. Marcus. Do we have information about Marcus? I mean, obviously we want. I have no idea. Yes, and of course the symposium in the spring. We want you to symposium. Faculty, please, we will be sending out the evaluation students. I so appreciate. We had them do the evaluations on Wednesday, so they are done. And now it's just up to faculty to do evaluations of the program. And the other question that I got asked at lunch is just a reminder. Part of why we're doing the evaluations of your presentations and posters is not just to teach you, it's to give you feedback so that when you go out into the world, you can go from A's to A+. And also, we do have 2 awards that will be announced in the next couple of weeks. One is for the best presentation, and one is for the best poster. And there is a monetary award that comes with that, and you get announced at the award ceremony in April. So, all of you get acknowledged for the work you did in this. And if you have any questions, I'm still around. And Melissa is still around. There are bags of chips up here, and I'll grab them before you leave. Yes. 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 Before you leave, collect the survey. Mine is actually on the top over there. Yes. We will send information in an email. And everybody can go. Yes. Bye, everybody online.